Thank you very much. That's a very warm welcome. I'm really honoured and delighted to be here and to open your new season, so to speak. I should start by explaining the title, Russia and Asia, Once Again with Feeling. Covering as I have Russian foreign policy over the past 30 years, it struck me that there have been many times when Russia has spoken about developing an Asia policy, a more diversified, less Western-centric approach to the world. And each time there's been sort of flamboyant rhetoric, but a singular lack of achievement. Only this time, it looks, perhaps, as if Putin and the Russian political elite are finally getting serious. So that's really the topic of my lecture today. But before we get into some of the detail, it's worth defining what we mean. We're defining our terms. What is Asia? Or rather, what does Putin understand as Asia? Because Asia is not, as we might think, all the way from the Near East to the Asia Pacific. Really, the Near East for Russia is the Middle East. Central Asia for Russia is post-Soviet Central Asia, or more broadly, the post-Soviet space. And so really, Asia for Russians is Asia Pacific plus India. But Asia is also not just a physical entity. It's really redolent of symbolism, because it represents, more than anything else for Russians and Russia, an archetypal non-West, the vanguard of the non-West, representing an alternative legitimacy, different norms, different values, different institutions, and in a sense getting away from the tyranny of the West, at least as viewed from the Kremlin. And yet, it's quite surprising, this positive attitude that we see in Moscow towards Asia, and towards China, and towards other Asian countries. Because, frankly, the historical legacy has been highly unpromising and been generally negative. For many centuries, Moscow simply neglected Asia. It was regarded as a rather unimportant part of the world. Russia extended its empire to the Pacific, but really, its cities like Vladivostok, they were really frontier posts. They weren't seeking to create a gateway to the Pacific, but really more defend against the threat of the East. So either you had neglect, or you had this notion of the East as threat, unknown, but incredibly dangerous. And I was reading something on the train today which pointed out the only two wars, or the only two military conflicts that Russia has actually lost in the course of a long history has been the Mongol invasion of the 13th century, and of course the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Otherwise, it's, for all the talk about threat coming from the West, it's actually managed to, in the end, emerge victorious. But that has not been the case in relation to the East. So there's a real sense that the East represented real threat. And of course, events, not just the 1905 war against Japan, the Mongol invasion, but more recent events have tended to reinforce this idea of the East as threat. And the main one, of course, is the 33-decade-long Sino-Soviet freeze. It was called, in the 1950s, the unbreakable friendship. Of course, it proved anything but that. And even today, and we'll talk a bit more about it later, but even today, this idea that there is this rising behemoth not really to Russia's east, but to its south, in the form of China, that still creates, it's something visceral, so that even though the relationship is going really well in lots of respects, there is that kind of atavistic concern. So, but we should acknowledge that with the fall of the Soviet Union, with the end of the Cold War, there was a major shift, a real change in pattern. And I was trying to think, why was this so? I think it's mainly because the end of the Cold War saw a de-ideologization of international politics. So really, no longer ideological confrontation between East and West. Now you think, well, how is that relevant to China or Asia? But really, it meant that we saw the emergence of a much more pragmatic, interest-based, a more really positive, to use a sort of casual word, vibe in the conduct of Russian foreign policy. And so you see a return of pragmatism in Sino-Russian relations. You see a partial normalization of relations between Moscow and Tokyo. The trouble is, and here's the catch, here's the downside, is that yes, there were reduced tensions between Russia and the East and Russia and the West, but whereas reduced tensions in with the West led to increased cooperation, in the East it kind of fostered a sort of benign neglect. Yeah, Asia's vaguely important, there's China and there's Japan, but really it's not central, because after all, we are Europeans. Russian culture is Western, is European. And so that is where our priorities, and yes, I suppose, we pay lip service to an Eastern policy, to an Asian policy, but really we don't take Asia that seriously. And if they took it at all seriously, it was mainly as a function of an overall Russian foreign policy, as a sort of byproduct of Russia's more productive but also more complex relations with the West. So the Asia-Pacific, or Asia in general, was less important for its own sake than as to be used as a kind of leverage with the West. And it's no coincidence at this time that we see the re-emergence of a kind of strategic triangularism, but not just the United States and Russia, but Moscow looking to China to kind of even up the odds in its perpetual contest against the United States, even post-Cold War. Now, fast forward to the Putin era, sort of last 20 years, or nearly 20 years. These trends, we've seen sort of further major shifts. And I think the main drivers here have been Vladimir Putin's growing disillusionment with the West. This was a real game changer, has been a game changer. And also the global financial crisis. Putin's disillusionment with the West and the sense that the West can no longer be trusted, and that Western institutions, norms, power really has feet of clay, has led to a real expansion of the Sino-Russian partnership in particular. There has been an increased emphasis on geopolitical balancing against the United States, and also the use of Asia as a kind of economic leverage vis-à-vis Europe as well. And so what we see in Putin's first decade is a sort of an increasing Asianization of Russian foreign policy, or perhaps more accurately, Sinicization of Russian foreign policy. And so we finally get this term, this expression, Pavarot na Vostok, turn to the east. In fact, that means Moscow's turn to the east, because as I'm sure you're well aware, when you look at the map, Russia is actually some way further east than China. But and so what we have is this emergence of something that resembles an Asia policy. Only I wouldn't call it an Asia policy, because that implies a sort of multi-vectored, balanced, diversified Asia policy. I would call it a China-first policy in Asia. That brings us to today. So what are the primary features, motivations, drivers of Moscow's approach to Asia, meaning the Asia-Pacific? I think the most important lesson is that Russia looks at Asia through a globalist lens. Of course, Asia and Asia-Pacific has intrinsic importance, but its main importance is as a player, as a theatre in a larger global game. And so Asia is fundamental to Putin's vision of geopolitical balancing, of a new post-Western world order in which Russia is this great indispensable power balancing between the United States and China, being a civilizational and even economic bridge between East and West, Asia and Europe. It is the great middle, the Mackinder heartland power. Now, the corollary of this is that sometimes it's misleading to talk about Russia going Asian or following a European or a Western direction. Because really Putin prizes, it seems to me, he prizes above all the virtues of strategic flexibility. And the idea is that Russia is not beholden to either East or West, China or the United States. It's beholden to no one but itself. It is second, subordinate to no one. And this leads on to Russia always wanting to preserve options, always thinking we can go East, we can be West, we can be any identity. We are Russians, Europeans, Asians, Muslim, post-Soviet, it doesn't matter. We are everything. And that is what makes us unique. As a Russian journalist friend put it to me once, all peoples think they are unique, but Russians think they are more unique than the others. So what Putin is trying to do is not just position Russia as this indispensable global power, this middle power, not only trying to preserve strategic flexibility, but also to be a key player in regional security building in the Asia-Pacific. And because the Asia-Pacific is so important, that means key player in global security building. And all this is based on the premise that the centre of gravity in world affairs is shifting inexorably from West to East. Asia, and particularly Asia-Pacific, is the crucible of 21st century politics, economics, geopolitics. It's the happening place. And so for Russia to be taken seriously, for it to continue to feel that warm sense of self-esteem, it needs to be part of this dynamic game, needs to be part of this happening place called the Asia-Pacific. And that means really raising its game from what it was before. Now, of course, there are commercial factors. There's commercial opportunities. There's a perception that the Asia-Pacific is a kind of El Dorado. It's a source of investment. It's also a source of new markets. And so, again, Russians see real opportunities in the Asia-Pacific, but these opportunities aren't merely commercial, because to take these opportunities means to position Russia as a key economic player. To be a key economic player in the Asia-Pacific means to be a key geopolitical player. Because sometimes you get people saying, oh, well, look, there's economics here and there's geopolitics there. But really, the Russians understand a lesson from the Chinese in particular, that when economic power grows, it can grow to such an extent it automatically has considerable geopolitical consequences. And then there is a final element, which is image building and the quest for respectability. Now, here in the UK, in many Western countries, I hardly need to say this, but Russia has a shocking reputation. But we sometimes forget that its reputation, although not great in a lot of non-Western countries, is much, much better there. And so part of the explanation of Russia's shift to Asia, its embrace of China, but not just China, India, the ASEAN countries, Middle East, and so on, is because it is trying to pitch to the unconverted yet. It feels that it can develop its reputation. It can promote Russia as a responsible, constructive, regional, as well as global citizen. All the more so when we are living in the age of Trump. I want to now move to some of the selected relationships because, so far I've been dealing in sort of big picture stuff, but I think Russian foreign policy, for all the talk about multipolarity, multilateral approaches, for all its criticism of American unilateralism, and Russians ultimately believe that bilateral relationships are what it's all about. The multilateral institutions provide the kind of a veneer of legitimacy, but fundamentally it is about that key bilateral relationship. By the way, it's one of the reasons why Putin and Trump get along quite well, because they speak the same kind of bilateral language. They speak the same kind of zero-sum win-lose. This is very much part of their mentality. There may be also other reasons why Trump is so beholden to Putin, but we won't go there, at least not today. Now, the Sino-Russian partnership. This is the cornerstone of Russia's Asia policy. In fact, as I mentioned, I prefer to call it a China plus policy in Asia, because China is the geopolitical and normative counterweight to the United States and its allies. In fact, if we, this is counterfactual, but if China was, say, were located in Latin America, then Latin America would be up front and center in Russian foreign policy. So the interest that Russians have in Asia has less to do with Asia than with the fact that China happens to be located there, because China is not seen as just an Asian power, it is now seen as a global behemoth. Sino-Russian relations have never been better. You can see that from the atmospherics, but also, expanding cooperation in many fields, military, economic, political. The two sides agree on most international issues. They agree on Syria. They oppose grassroots democracy, Arab Spring kind of things. And they both agree that it's a fundamentally good idea to limit the exercise of US power around the world. There is no disagreement on that thing. Importantly, they don't really have any serious disagreement. So there's nothing really to spoil the relationship. There's no deal breaker there. And of course, as you'll have seen, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin seem to get along pretty well. And that kind of personal rapport is important. You can overestimate its importance, but it's clearly helpful in this case. Putin also attaches considerable value to the relationship with China because, in a sense, associating with China makes him look good. And I mean, not necessarily respectable, but it makes him look powerful, because I'm with the strongest guy in the class. I'm with this country that everyone's kind of in awe of. And so Putin and Russia benefit from a kind of success by association. However, despite all this sort of public like-mindedness, this is not, as some people would argue, this is not an authoritarian entente, much less is it a de facto alliance. I argue in this book, this Wary Embrace, that there are critical differences in Russian and Chinese perspectives, priorities, and interests. And we see this. I'll just go through a couple of them because they're interesting, I think. First, China and Russia have very different attitudes towards the existing international system. The Chinese recognize that over the last 30 years, they have been the prime beneficiary of the US-led order, of Western-led globalization. So for all their complaints about its unfairness and how they'd like to make it better, they recognize that they have done very well, thank you very much. The Russians, by contrast, have seen this US-led global order as fundamentally inimical to Russian interests. They see themselves, perhaps they have a point, as the biggest loser out of a US-led world order. So the attitudes of Beijing and Moscow to the existing system differ greatly. Now, the Chinese clearly want to change the existing system, but they quite like it. So what they want the existing system to do is to better reflect China's much increased status and to also be more responsive to Chinese interests. The Russians basically want to trash the system. They think it's irremediable. The second thing is, Moscow and Beijing talk a lot about the multipolar world order. But the multipolar order, what is multipolarity? I never understand this term. I mean, multipolarity is it's like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder. Now, the Russian attitude towards multipolarity is really a tripolar world order. It's the big three. It's Yalta 1945, as it were, sort of revamped. So you have the United States, Russia, and China, and they are the three colossi in the world. The Chinese see things rather differently. The Chinese see the US-China relationship as the pivot of global governance. Now, of course, they respect Russia as a great power. But for the Chinese, the Russians are a second, or for some Chinese, a third-tier power. So it's essentially, the system they're looking at, the so-called multipolar order, is really a bipolarity plus accommodation with the United States. And then they have very different attitudes towards relations with the United States. Yes, true, both sides want to see Washington's wings clipped. But the default mode in China's relations with the United States is still one of accommodation. They recognize that there are tremendous tensions, tremendous disagreements, but they are committed to maintaining some sort of cooperative relationship with the Americans. The Russians, not so much. The Russians see, of course they take the United States seriously, but they have very few hopes of a productive relationship with the United States. So what that means is their default mode is essentially one of competition and often confrontation. So compared this to the Chinese default mode of accommodation. And then if we look at the Asia-Pacific itself, in the Asia-Pacific, China wants to be top dog. I think that's pretty clear. Whereas the Russians, they don't want to see one hegemon in the form of the United States be replaced by another, possibly less benign hegemon in the form of China. And so what they really want, what the Russians want, is a more diversified environment where Chinese power, in Chinese leadership in the Asia-Pacific is diluted, is mitigated by prominent roles for other major Asian powers. Not just the United States, but India, Japan, and collectively the ASEANs. And this is also true in Eurasia, in Central Eurasia. The Chinese, the Russians really want to hold on to the Mackinder-like heartland, because one of the prerequisites of being a global power, of being seen as a global power, is to be top dog in your neighbourhood. And you can't very well be top dog in Eurasia if the Belt and Road initiative is running rampant. So here's the concern, that Chinese power, for the moment apparently benign, has the potential to, frankly, displace Russian influence from Eurasia. So these are just some of the areas where Russian and Chinese perspectives and interests differ considerably. And I hope you'll agree with me that these differences, they're not differences of detail. They're differences of principle. They have considerable strategic implications. But perhaps the most challenging area of the relationship between Russia and China is the fact that it's increasingly unequal. And this doesn't just have practical consequences. For Russia, it's very difficult to be anyone's number two. But at least with the West, with the United States, they're kind of used to the United States being better than them, being stronger than them. But with the Chinese, they've had 300 years of superiority and superior attitudes towards the Chinese. So the psychological transformation is much, much more difficult. Now, having said that, I think the Sino-Russian partnership is pretty stable. But the challenge looking ahead will be to sustain the momentum of cooperation in the face of multiple challenges. And these challenges are obviously the growing inequality of the relationship, an increasingly ambitious globalist Chinese foreign policy, strategic tensions in Eurasia, insecurities within Russia, and of course, contrasting visions of global governance. Moving to Japan. Regrettably, not just from Tokyo's perspective, but also from Moscow's, this is an essentially stagnant relationship. And this is despite Shinzo Abe's unbelievable efforts to try and normalize the relationship. The problem is there are two key realities, two major obstacles, and they are the territorial dispute over the Southern Kurils Northern Territories, dating from the end of the Second World War, and the continuing strength of the US-Japan security alliance. These two obstacles really greatly limit the potential for progress in Russia-Japan relations. There is also a third aspect, which is a fundamental divergence in threat perceptions and strategic assessments between Tokyo and Moscow. They differ, for example, obviously on the threat that China poses. They disagree on appropriate policies towards North Korea, and clearly their views on the United States could hardly be more different. The difficulty here, particularly for Tokyo, is that Moscow holds the whip hand. It not only has the issue that possession is 9/10 of the law, in this case 10/10 of the law, but there's also part of the problem with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He's trying so hard to normalize the relationship, to fulfill the destiny of his father, who was who just before he died saw Gorbachev. The Japanese are so desperate, so the Russians are saying, you know what, we don't have to do anything. We don't have to make any concessions. And so, when you're ready, you'll concede. And that's never a very healthy approach to improving a relationship. India. Russia-India relations are free of serious tensions. You have sweet honeyed words in New Delhi and Moscow, but really this is a limited relationship. The cooperative agenda there's a strong cooperative agenda, but in a very narrow range of areas. Arms sales, nuclear technology. There's some possibilities in oil and gas development, but still nascent at this stage. And again, the potential is limited. The potential for further cooperation is limited by Moscow's prioritization of the Sino-Russian partnership, and of course, the abiding strategic tensions between China and India. And there's another factor that's come in play in recent years, which is the growing warmth of US-India ties. And even more recently, Moscow's outreach to Islamabad, to Pakistan. So this is a relationship, again, sort of a little bit stagnant. It's okay, but nothing much is happening. The Koreas. Well, let's focus really here on North Korea. Here, on North Korea and the Korean Peninsula, Russia faces two conundrums. One conundrum is it would like to be a real player in the region on the Korean Peninsula, but unfortunately no one else really sees it as terribly significant on Korean issues. So there's this disconnect between geopolitical ambition and very limited capacity. And then there's another conundrum, which is that Russia would like to pursue an independent policy towards North Korea, towards Korean issues generally, but it is constrained by having to follow Beijing's lead, because ultimately it recognises that the Koreas are as important to Beijing as Ukraine is important to Moscow. So it's a kind of don't mess with Chinese objectives and interests. Follow the Chinese lead. And so this is really constraining, and it's an irritant, but not big enough irritant to do anything about. Quick word on the ASEANs. Relations are growing, yes. Moscow is trying to reach out, but of course these are very limited. The one partial exception to the rule here is Vietnam. We are seeing increased Russian participation in Asian multilateral structures, APEC, East Asia Summit, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. But this involvement is still not very significant, but it is, I suppose, indicative of a certain degree of intent. Moscow clearly wants to expand its options. It wants to improve its international reputation, but let's not kid ourselves. We're still in the very, very early stages of a long game. So where are we going with all this? What does the future hold? I think there's no doubt that Russia will continue to expand its presence and participation in the Asia-Pacific. I think that is a given. There is a genuine level of intent, a genuine degree of intent and commitment that simply wasn't there before. And indeed, the Trump factor will accentuate this trend, and not because the Americans are being mean to us and therefore we need to go to Asia. It's more than that. The Trump factor is creating, as we've seen from his speech yesterday at the UN, a really unstable, fluid international environment where there appear to be very few certainties. Certainly, old certainties are dying out, and new certainties, new truths have not really emerged yet. So in this unstable world, what do you do? What is your natural policy reaction? Well, it is to rely on things that are relatively stable, that appear good for the longer term, such as the Sino-Russian partnership. And so it's not just China, but the whole Asia-Pacific has assumed a primary regional and global importance for the Kremlin. However, there's no doubt that Russia faces significant challenges in establishing itself as a serious player in the Asia-Pacific. Partly it's a result of its own limitations, but partly it's because, you know what, other Asian countries aren't really that happy to see a much increased role for Russia. They have competing agendas, and after all, who wants a wannabe global power just to make an already complex situation even more complicated? I think in Moscow we'll see an enduring Sinocentrism. Yes, Moscow recognizes that it would be good to have a more diversified approach towards Asia. But ultimately, Asia matters as a region because of the China relationship. And balancing the United States by hitching onto China is much more important and much more immediate than balancing China with, say, Japan or India in the regional context of Asia-Pacific. I don't think, although we are seeing a much more serious commitment from Moscow, I'm not yet convinced that we are seeing a structural shift away from the traditional Western centrism of Russian foreign policy. The Russian political elite remains fixated on the United States. Commercial and cultural ties with Europe are far, far closer than with Asia. And so in these circumstances, a strategic reorientation back to Europe, or even a renewed focus on Eurasia, I think remains very much in play. And ultimately, we have to remember that Putin's focus is global, not Asian. Asia and the Asia-Pacific is just part of a larger picture, a larger game. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that fascinating and very wide-ranging discourse. I started my career in the Foreign Office 30-odd years ago in what was then called Soviet Department, and one of the great things about that job was that because the Soviet Union poked its nose into the business of every other country in the world, Soviet Department got to poke its nose into every other bit of the Foreign Office. It's good to hear that in that fundamental respect, at least, the perspective from Moscow has not really changed. Can I open up to questions? Lady over there.
Hi. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the recent military exercises between Russia and China, and what you made of Abe's visit to Russia very, very shortly afterwards.
Yeah. Shall I take each question? Or do
Shall we take two or three at a time? Yeah.
Yes, you spoke very briefly about China's Belt and Road project. I just find it rather difficult to see how Russia is going to reconcile opening up or developing a warmer relationship with China when China appears to be slowly stabbing it in the back, as it were.
Yeah. You're not the only one. Yes.
Do we have a third question yet, or the lady?
Thank you for your talk. It was fascinating. Made my head spin. But I want to ask. Trump says America first. Can you see Putin saying Russia first?
Yeah. Very good questions.
Why don't we take those? And
Sure.
I'll keep my eye open.
Okay. Let's start with the military exercises. The military exercises, Vostok 2018, are significant, but I feel that much of the Western commentariat and media's reaction to these exercises has been somewhat overwrought. So why are the exercises important? They are apparently the largest exercises since 1981. Even if you don't believe the Kremlin's claims that there are 300,000 Russian soldiers involved, because that would be a third of the Russian army, they're still big exercises. They're pursuing a more ambitious military agenda. They're trying harder things than in the past. So these are important exercises. Now, people are thinking, oh gosh, what about the Chinese? So we know that there are about 3,000 Chinese soldiers involved, along with sort of assorted bits of military equipment. Now, some people have interpreted this as this is part of the Sino-Russian alliance. This is a qualitatively new stage where they're going to be really military coordinated, and you're going to see Chinese soldiers in Western conflicts and Russian soldiers over in the Asia-Pacific. Again, this is, in my view, vastly exaggerated. Put yourself in the Kremlin's shoes. You are organising a massive military exercise on the Chinese and Mongolian borders. Now, what do you think would be Beijing's reaction if you said, no, sorry, Chinese soldiers, not allowed? So part of it is a confidence-building measure. You bring the you bring the Chinese in to show that you are part of the game. You're not the target of these exercises. So that is of critical importance. But it's also consistent with a whole series of sort of Sino-Russian military exercises. We've seen joint sea exercises in the Mediterranean and also Western Pacific. We've seen the sort of Shanghai Cooperation Organization exercises in so-called anti-terrorism exercises in various venues. But so Chinese participation is consistent with developing political and military ties between Russia and China. So they do have a public relations purpose. There's also, but mainly I see them as confidence building, but also a confidence building, I mean, between Russia and China. But it's good to frighten Western commentators, to frighten Western policymakers into believing that, you know what, Russia and China is thick as thieves. You are pushing us away. You, the West, are to blame. So, watch out, really. You better be nicer to us. And if you're nicer to us, maybe we won't be so close to the Chinese. So they're really trying to use exercises like this as a form of leverage. So that shock news element shouldn't be underestimated. But finally, let's get this into perspective here. 3,000 Chinese troops, estimated 300,000, even if we call it 100,000, it's a tiny percentage. This is not full-scale military coordination. This is essentially military diplomacy. Now, what I would argue is that I believe that China poses tremendous challenges to the United States, to the West. I believe that Russia poses tremendous challenges to the West. But I also believe that Russia and China are somewhat less than the sum of their parts, mainly for the reasons I've outlined before. They have different perspectives, different priorities, and different interests. They are, in other words, separate, individual actors that coordinate with the other when it suits their particular purposes. But to try and imagine this as some kind of alliance, a sort of US, UK, NATO, that kind of thing, I think is nonsensical. Now, on the Belt and Road Initiative, this is really interesting. Now, the Russians are sensitive to China's growing influence across Eurasia, not just Central Asia, but you go to Georgia and there are spanking new Chinese hotels, and China is the second largest overseas investor in Ukraine after the EU. So they might support Russia politically over Ukraine, but economically they're not averse to turning the situation to their advantage. Now, the Russians know this, they're not dummies. But the problem is there's not really a lot they can do about it because they have so few strategic options. They have to bank on the Chinese. It always makes me laugh when the Chinese talk about win-win, because they really mean, there are two ways to look at it. Like, you either haven't negotiated hard enough, or we win and then we win again. We win twice. So that's a particularly cynical but not necessarily inaccurate view of proceedings. So the Russians know they can't really do anything about China's expanding influence across Eurasia. So you've had this sort of idea that, well, maybe we can manage it. And so in 2015, Putin and Xi Jinping oversaw the signing of this agreement combining the Moscow-led Eurasian Economic Union, EEU, and China's SREB, Silk Road Economic Belt. But here's the rub. This was supposed to combine the two projects, have lots of win-win outcomes. Instead, what we found out is that since that time, the EEU, which means mainly Russia, has suggested some 40 infrastructural projects to the Chinese, and the Chinese have binned every one of them. So they're not interested. So at the moment, they're trying to sort of say, well, there's also a division of labour. The Chinese, of course, they're economically more influential, but we are still the primary security provider. And actually, that is still true. But the situation is changing rapidly. And what I referred to earlier is that this distinction between economic influence on the one hand and geopolitical reach on the other is utterly artificial and therefore unsustainable. Because when economic power develops to the extent as it has under China, it automatically has geopolitical implications. The problem is, bottom line, you don't like it? What are you going to do about it? And I can't do anything about it because they just have to hope that the Chinese will exercise a certain restraint. And as indeed they are doing, because the Chinese recognise that it's not so much that they need Russia to help them with the United States or in achieving other foreign policy goals. The problem is that they've learned, the Chinese here observe the Western experience with Russia. Russia may not be able to help, but it can certainly hinder. And so the Russians can be a real pain in the arse in Eurasia, so best to keep them sweet, give them face. And so that actually moderates Chinese behaviour for the time being. We'll see, but I think this situation is unstable. Trump. America first. The sort of version of my country right or wrong, really, isn't it? Now, Putin, long before Trump came on the scene, had my country right or wrong. So, frankly, Trump is a novice compared to Putin. And it was fascinating to look at them in the Helsinki summit. There's a wonderful photo. I wrote an article called Going Legit, the foreign policy of Vladimir Putin. It came out a few days ago. And I mention this not because of the article itself, but there's a great photo at the head of the article which shows Putin, they're at their joint press conference, and Putin is looking disgustingly smug. And Trump is looking befuddled and beaten, And it's fascinating. So, really, it's master and novice here. So long before Trump came up with America first, Putin was doing it. And you can see, Putin, whenever they're together, Putin just runs rings around Trump.
So he doesn't need to say Russia first?
No, it's implicit. And it's stronger for being implicit.
Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Burton, then Anthony.
Russia, India.
Yep.
You gave the impression that the relationship was fairly stagnant and not much going on, and indeed that Russia was very relaxed about that. I find that surprising because in the Soviet era, Russia invested a great deal in the relationship with India.
Agree.
And so here we are now that we don't seem to be giving it much importance. Is the lack of interest on the Indian side because India now feels that the United States has more to offer it than Russia, and that from India's point of view, it's better to have the United States alongside it as an ally containing China than taking much interest in Russia, which has a totally different attitude towards China, comes into the picture.
Yeah, okay.
Could you talk a little bit about the vast territory, lost territory of Kazakhstan?
Yeah, sure. Pleasure.
Perhaps of oil and gas, politics, finance.
Yep.
The other, yeah, gentleman here.
You said a little bit about the to the south and west, the Pakistan influence of China and Russia. Both lots of interest there. General Nicholson was accusing Russia of supporting the Taliban, and certainly Russians want Taliban as part of the solution in Afghanistan. China obviously investing massively in the China-Pakistan corridor through Pakistan. Both have an interest in stability there, but also possibly an interest in continuing to spoil the Americans.
Sure.
Can I just take?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, of course.
As you implied, economic power matters in geopolitics. If you take the view that in the longer run, say 10, 15 years, China's economic power is going to increase massively, and Russia's, as far as one can see, relatively little. Surely that makes a huge difference in the relationship.
Yeah, agreed. Shall I go with that? Okay, great. All right. Russia, India. If we cast our minds back to the Soviet era, the Soviet Union's relations with China were appalling. Even before Nixon's 1972 visit, the Sino-Soviet, I mean, this was a crisis. This was a cold confrontation lasting 30 years with occasional actual fighting, like in 1969. So in terms of Asian alternatives, Moscow didn't really have any alternatives. You know, there was India and there was Vietnam, but Vietnam really sort of pretty marginal, stuck at the end of Southeast Asia. But in broad strategic terms, India was it. And even so, India wasn't really an ally as such. It was more non-aligned, but partial, and obviously bought Soviet weapons. So it was a sort of benevolent neutrality, is how I would describe India at the time. Come today, Russia feels it has more Asian options. And in particular, it has the China relationship. So the China relationship, for all the tacit tensions and differences that I've mentioned, nevertheless is essentially a pretty good, strong relationship, and both sides would settle for that. It's gone better than expected. So that has to be your top priority. There's also a perception in Moscow that India has punched well below its weight in international affairs. Yes, it's prominent in the UN, but it's not a member of the UN P5. It's got no significant geopolitical reach beyond South Asia. It's not a player in Central Asia, which is one of the reasons why Moscow is flirting with Islamabad. And so there's a sense that, what can the Indians really give us? Yes, they're a market for arms and nuclear technology, but they can't really swing things. Plus, there are these well-documented strategic tensions with China. So if you had to pick one, which one do you pick? Well, you always, if you're a Russian, you pick the Chinese here. And then, of course, then you have the US-India rapprochement. And the thing is, the Russians know that the Indians will go to the Americans rather than to Russia because, well, the Americans are stronger. They're more powerful, they're richer, they have far greater global reach. They are, the Americans, the one genuine global power. Russia is not that, notwithstanding its pretensions. So there is a sense that, from the Russian perspective, that India, A, doesn't have much to offer, and B, is constrained by its relationship with the United States. Now, when the Indians look at Russia, they think enthralled to the Chinese. You know, they look at the Belt and Road Initiative and they think, yeah, Indians are opposed to the Belt and Road Initiative. The Russians seem to be just waving it through. So, do you really, if you're an Indian, do you really trust Moscow to do the right thing by you? No. So hence India is looking to the United States, looking to its relationship with Japan, for example, because the Indians see that the rise of China is the great geopolitical challenge of Asia and indeed the world. So these are some of the reasons why the relationship hasn't, it's okay. There's no crisis in the relationship. It's not about to fall apart. The Indians aren't about to become a US ally, but the US just simply has much more to offer, and the Russians are, they're the poor relation. Let's be fair. On Kazakhstan, this is interesting. Kazakhstan, under President Nursultan Nazarbayev, who's been there since 1991, has pursued a very clever balancing policy between Russia, China, and the West. And in a sense, he's pursued the classic small state strategy when you're surrounded by great powers. So he's been very respectful to the Russians. He's sucked in Chinese investment, and he's joined all sorts of Western-led organisations. There's an agreement with the EU. Kazakhstan held the presidency of the OSCE. So this has gone very well from Kazakhstan's perspective. But, there's always a big but here, Nazarbayev is old. He's 75 plus. And that means that even, how long is he going to stay in power? 5 years? Possibly 10 years? But there are big questions about what happens to Kazakhstan after Nazarbayev departs. And here's the thing. A few years ago, Putin said, classic backhanded compliment. President Nazarbayev's done a fantastic thing, because before him, there was no state of Kazakhstan, essentially saying, this one man, through the force of his personality and through his great talent and savvy, managed to create a state where there wasn't one. The implication there, of course, is, when Nazarbayev goes, what happens to Kazakhstan? So Kazakhstan is this artificial state. And it should be pointed out that the Russian-speaking minority, ethnic Russian minority in Kazakhstan is 23% of the population, mainly in the north. In Ukraine, it was only 17%. So Kazakhstan is even more Russified culturally, ethnically, linguistically than eastern Ukraine. So this is something to bear in mind of what happens if and when Nazarbayev leaves. Now, it could be a very smooth succession, but let us say, for the sake of argument, that this new generation of Kazakhstan leaders wants to move closer to the West. Then that delicate balance of Kazakhstan balancing between Russia, China, and the West, that could be upset. And this is the big question mark as we look forward. This leads naturally on to Afghanistan Pakistan. This is another case where Russian and Chinese perspectives differ. The Russians are mucking around with the Taliban. They're using it not because they trust the Taliban, but because it's a form of leverage. It's a way of making themselves relevant in the equation. The Chinese agenda is very different. The Chinese, as you pointed out, are developing infrastructure. And as you develop your economic presence, then you need you want stability. You don't want it to be a big anarchic mess. So the Chinese have a much greater vested interest in a stable, or more or less stable Afghanistan and Central Asia than do the Russians. Because the Russians look at instability as, too much instability is very bad, because then you might have to actually get involved in a big way. But a little bit of instability always ensures that you have a role to play, because you can, as a weaker power, you can always operate in the crevices, so to speak. Now, the Chinese also have a particular agenda. It's not just about Afghanistan, it's about Western China. You'll all have seen reports about 1 million Uyghurs being in various concentration camps. Now, That might be, there may be multiple reasons for that, but one reason is to try and stabilise, however misguided this effort is, to stabilise what has always been a highly volatile region. So the Chinese see a stable Central Asia, a stable Afghanistan, not only as virtues in themselves, but also as having implications of creating a more stable overall environment that has domestic implications for Western China. The Russians don't have this issue. This is not their problem. This is miles away from where, and as I mentioned, a certain degree of controlled, limited instability gives them a certain degree of leverage.
I think there was. Did we cover everything?
Sorry, fourth question. I didn't turn over the page. My apologies. So, you're talking about Chinese economic power translating into geopolitical influence. What does this mean over in the longer term? I think it makes for, let's put it euphemistically, makes for a much more complicated relationship. Because right now people say, well, they ask the Russians, well, don't you see the China threat? Yes, the Russians see a major challenge coming from China. But for the time being, that challenge is more distant, more elusive, it's really hard to pin down, than the clear and present danger presented by the United States. So it's not that we see China as entirely benign. I think very, very few Russians look at China in that way. They are intimidated, apprehensive about the rise of Chinese power, and they think, where does it all end? But the thing is, right now they don't have the luxury of that. And Russian policymakers don't tend to think long term. They tend to think here and now. It itches, where do we, I must scratch it. So the United States is this clear and present danger. It's something that they understand or feel they understand. They understand the threat, the geopolitical threat, the normative threat, the economic threat even, posed by the West, by the United States. But China's just not front and centre yet as a threat. It's front and centre as an ally helping to mitigate or counterbalance that clear and present danger. What happens in 10 years' time, though? Because this is the thing. In 2001, total Chinese trade with the 5 Central Asian states of the former Soviet Union was a mere 1 billion. They were nothing. And yet, within the space of less than a decade, they had overtaken Russia's trade with those same 5 Central Asian states. So things move unbelievably quickly, as we've seen, especially when they're kicked along by things like the global financial crisis and Russia's continuing weaknesses. So I expect the situation to change very rapidly. I still think, though, the Chinese will tread cautiously with Russia because they see that Russia still has very considerable destructive and obstructive capacity. But I see also, over the next decade, this suspension of disbelief. We pretend to like you and you pretend to believe us. This suspension of disbelief will become harder to sustain as the gap in capabilities between Russia and China becomes so wide.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm afraid we're out of time, so with apologies to those who would have wanted to ask questions, we can't take any more. But I will take this opportunity because Dr. Lo has given it to me to say, for those with a particular interest in Kazakhstan after Nazarbayev. On Monday evening, there's a meeting of the Dinner Club, now open to everybody without an additional membership subscription, at which Dr. Carolyn Brown, until recently ambassador to Kazakhstan, will be talking about exactly that subject. And if there is anyone who would like to come to that who has not yet said so, please let Brian Morvan know today, because tomorrow is when we have to give final numbers. And the other thing is to say that in January, jointly with King's College London and the Woodrow Wilson Centre, the Society is running a one-day conference on the Belt and Road Initiative, addressing both economic and geostrategic implications of that. And we will be publishing the detailed programme in due course. We're still talking to speakers about that, but I hope that we'll see a good number of you in the course of that day as well. It's the 7th of January. It just leaves me to say thank you very much indeed to Dr. Lo for an outstanding start.